This is CNN Breaking News.
All right, here we go. Let's continue on our breaking news here on CNN. I'm Brooke Baldwin. Thank you so much for being with me. You know, the big news today from the President of the United States. In his last news conference of the year, he addressed a myriad issues, including Sony, which really was the headline. Let me quote him precisely. He says, "Yes, I think they made a mistake yanking the release of the satirical comedy, The Interview, Christmas Day, and that those hackers are acting under the will of North Korea." That was confirmed by the FBI today. And what's more, this attack now has taken this new turn. Let me fill you in. Overnight, another threat against Sony. These hackers sent executives a message that confirmed all this criticism that by pulling the release of this film, The Interview, Sony gave the terrorists precisely what they wanted. Let me read this email for you, and just a heads up, the grammar isn't exactly perfect. This is what they say, quote, "It's very wise that you have made a decision to cancel the release of The Interview. It will be very useful for you. We believe you will never be engaged in something dangerous like that. Now we want you never let the movie released, distributed, or leaked in any form of, for instance, DVD or piracy, and we want everything related to the movie." It goes on, including its trailers, as well as its full version, down from any website hosting them immediately. We still have your private and sensitive data. We ensure the security of your data unless you make additional trouble, end quote. Again, from the president today, moments ago, saying yes, he is sympathetic to the plight currently facing Sony, but no, he says Sony shouldn't have pulled The Interview over this ongoing threat. Let me listen, and you listen to that part.
We cannot have a society in which some dictator someplace can start imposing censorship here in the United States. I think it says something interesting about North Korea that they decided to have the state mount an all-out assault on a movie studio because of a satirical movie starring Seth Rogen.
The president says he worries that, having seen this as an example, other studios, of course, other producers could retreat into censoring themselves. So, Michael Smerconish, let me bring you in, host of CNN Smerconish. I know you were listening to that, and listening to every single word, as I was, certainly from the president. And I'd plan on hitting, actually, on that point precisely with you off the top. So, let me begin with that. Like, this whole idea that Kim Jong Un, this petty, tyrant half a world away, could have any say whatsoever as to the content of our culture here in the States. Is that not just unreal to you?
Yeah, the whole thing is surreal. I mean, if what has played itself out in the last week or two were a part of a movie pitch, if you and I, Brooke, were to go into a Hollywood studio and say, now here's the idea for our movie, and we lay this whole chronology out, I think
a great movie.
It'd be a great movie, it'd be a hell of a movie, but I think they would have laughed us out and said, no, come on, it's too farcical. Yeah. I like what the president had to say, and I believe those are his sentiments. I'm surprised that he expressed them. I would have expected him to dodge, to him and haw, when asked a direct question about whether Sony made a mistake, and I'm glad that he said that it was a mistake, although I have to add this. It's very easy for those of us who are on the sidelines to say that Sony blew it, because it's not our personal data that right now hangs in the balance.
True, but he definitely didn't hem and haw, saying, I wish Sony had spoken to me first. I would have told them, don't get into this pattern in which you're intimidated. He pointed out, of course, the Boston bombing. And, if they had let the terrorists win, or these lone wolves in that case win, there wouldn't have been a marathon this year, and there was. The other issue, he was asked specifically, actually, 2 different times from 2 different reporters, how the United States will respond to this. And his answer, again, and not going farther than just saying the U.S. will respond proportionately. What would a proportional attack look like, Michael? Do we know?
I think it would, just one person's opinion, I think it would look like a Stuxnet type bug, much like was used presumably by the Israelis against the Iranian nuclear capability. My prediction is that there will be some action. There will not be any announcement by the White House that the action has been taken, but there will be fallout, and we'll be aware of it, and it'll be cyber warfare in its purpose, and there'll be no claim that's made that this is what we did, but rather a wink and a nod.
Okay. What about, though, that aside, here you have, now that this has been successful, considering success that Sony has yanked this film, from appearing in theaters Christmas Day. What's to prevent North Korea from saying, well, that worked. Let's try Bank of America. Let's try Google. Let's try the Pentagon. Because, we heard the president say today, we are way behind on cybersecurity. Congress needs to get on that.
And there are many in the government who've been saying this for a long time. It'll be odd if this is the wake-up call that brings it all home, but probably it will be. I mean, you think of Richard Clarke, the former national security advisor. He's gone so far as to write novels using much of this material as a plot line because he found that when he went out and he delivered speeches, people weren't taking him seriously. So that we need a wake-up call, I think, is certainly the case. But, Brooke, one other observation, if I can make it, because
Sure.
we're all laying this off on Sony. Sony shouldn't have done this. And I don't think Sony should have backed off. But in the end, it was the distributors. It was about a half dozen entities, those that control all the screens across the country, that all backed out and said, we're not going to distribute this movie. I would like to see it put on demand and give Americans on Christmas Day the opportunity to spend $5.99 or $6.99 and use it as a family activity and watch the movie at home in the protection of our own homes. I think that would send a wonderful message.
I think you're not alone. I think one of those reporters even asked President Obama if he'd be seeing the movie, and he said, listen, I've got a long list of films, but wouldn't that be something if the president comes out later and said, you know what, I saw the interview. Before I let you go, Michael Smerconish, I do want to ask you about Cuba because, of course, the president was asked about it. He said, obviously, he's pleased with what's happened so far, but he was very clear in saying, he doesn't plan on going to Cuba and meeting with Raul Castro anytime soon, and that if freedom happens, it'll be in fits and starts. You once interviewed Fidel Castro. In his heart of hearts, do you think Fidel Castro feels that he and his brother have finally given it, to the big Yankee imperialista to the north? They've given in?
I think the best thing that ever happened to Fidel Castro and to his brother Raul was the implementation of the Cuban embargo. I think that for 54 years, the embargo has succeeded in one respect, and that is keeping them in power because it created a boogeyman. It created an entity that they could blame everything on. It's a third world country. To be in Havana and the outlying areas is to see the abject poverty, but he always was able to lay it off on the foreign policy of the United States. What are they going to blame now? I mean, if things go terribly wrong for Cubans, as they have in the past, there won't be any blaming the United States going forward. So I think it's a good thing. And I think it's a good thing because what I'd most like to see is a change in leadership in Cuba. And how best to bring that about? Give them a taste of what we experience here on a day-to-day basis.
Michael Smerconish, can't wait to see you on TV on CNN
Thanks
tomorrow
for saying
morning.
that.
Thank you so much. Coming up next, George Clooney goes off on Sony and Hollywood and the media. Why? Because he tried to get support from movie executives and no one was willing to play ball. Hear his choice words for them and for Kim Jong Un. Also ahead here on CNN, is America prepared for cyber war? And what other countries have this kind of capability to attack? You're watching CNN Special Live coverage. I'm Brooke Baldwin. Stay with me. You're watching CNN. I'm Brooke Baldwin. George Clooney defends Sony Pictures, and he takes Hollywood to task for not standing by the studio as hackers linked to North Korea used this epic cyber attack and threats against theaters to force Sony to pull the plug on the interview. In this back-and-forth interview here with Deadline, Clooney says he sent top entertainment figures a petition supporting Sony. Thing is, he couldn't get anyone to sign it. This is part of what he told Deadline. Let me quote him. Nobody stood up. Nobody took that stand. Now, I say this is a situation we are going to have to come to terms with because this could happen to an electric company, a car company, a newsroom. It could happen to anybody. Clooney is fully behind releasing this movie in some form, even online. He says, do whatever you can to get this movie out. Not because everybody has to see the movie, but because I'm not going to be told we can't see the movie. That's the most important part. We cannot be told we can't see something by Kim Jong Un of all bleep people. Clooney also blasts the news media for failing to see the bigger picture and focusing solely on these salacious emails involving famous people. This is what he said on that. There was a real story going on. With just a little bit of work, you could have found out that it wasn't just probably North Korea, it was North Korea. I have Mike Fleming on the phone, Mike Fleming of Deadline, who is the one who conducted that interview with George Clooney. So, Mike, how'd you get the interview?
Well, I had heard that he was going to try to get all the support for the petition. And so I reached out, and we had an agreement that when he did, I would break a story about it. And so the story that I broke was actually much more interesting, but there have been so many twists and turns in this story that you never could have predicted. And this was just one of them, the idea that nobody would sign a petition of support for Sony.
You're not kidding on the twists and turns. Let's back up a half step. When we talk about this petition, explain to our viewers, what was the purpose of this petition that George Clooney and his agent apparently were trying to get signatures?
The purpose of the petition, I think, was just to establish that Sony and its leadership, Amy Pascal and Michael Lynn, were not alone, and that the community recognized what was happening here. This divide and conquer campaign that was going on, where these embarrassing emails were released and basically polarized everyone in Hollywood from supporting them. But in this case, the most powerful people in Hollywood were asked to sign a simple petition of support, and they didn't want to do it because they didn't want to put themselves in the hackers' crosshairs.
When you say the most powerful people in Hollywood, did George Clooney say specifically who he went to? Because I know he told you he went to some pretty big names, because once you have the big name sign on, right, then you have that trickle-down effect. Who did he get, and why exactly did they say no?
He wouldn't say, and I didn't press him because that isn't George's style. And what I liked about George's interview was he wasn't really condemning anyone, kind of the way that Aaron Sorkin made pointed comments about the media. George understands everyone's rationale for acting in their own self-interest and what their self-interests are, including the media. Mm-hmm. He just felt that this was unfortunate, that that here you have what turns out to be a cyber terror attack by a hostile foreign country on a communications business in the United States, and everyone put their heads in the sand, pretty much, at least according to what George told me.
It was a fantastic interview, and I think one of the headlines that hasn't gotten as much buzz is what I wanted to ask you about, because we here at CNN, we've been reporting that Sony, has zero plans of releasing this online or elsewhere, but George Clooney, in your back and forth, had told you he had a conversation with Amy Pascal, and she told a different story.
Well, the thing is, they don't know what to do. This is a completely unprecedented occurrence. No one expected it. There is no playbook of how to handle this crisis. So even though they may be having those conversations, I don't know if just today the people at Sony apparently received an email telling them that they would call up the cyber dogs if they just let this movie die. So do they want a fresh batch of attacks and to be left alone and polarized and have to absorb more damage for a comedy? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they're willing to go in and pay the price for even though it's for an important principle.
Mike Fleming of Deadline with the big get with the interview with George Clooney. Thank you so much for calling in. I appreciate it. And we're going to stay on the story because my next guest, a longtime movie critic, says the quote-unquote faceless cowards have won. But the big question, what happens, flash forward 5 years, 10 years from now? Will anyone in Hollywood take a risk? Plus, the head of Sony just now sitting down with CNN and responding to the president's remarks that the company just made a total mistake. This is CNN. This is Just In. Stay with me.